Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Oxford Dictionary defines déjà vu as a feeling of having already experienced the present situation. Many in Canada may be getting major déjà vu vibes from a recent transit proclamation from Ottawa. It's time for another high-speed rail announcement. Here's what the federal government has announced. It's confirmed that the first segment of Canada's proposed Alto high-speed rail will run between Montreal and Ottawa. It marks the initial build-out for a larger network that, if fully built, would link Toronto to Quebec City with trains capable of reaching speeds of up to 300 kilometers an hour. Ottawa-Montreal section would be about 200 kilometers long, and construction is expected to begin in 2029. Transport officials say they chose the relatively shorter, straight Montreal-Ottawa corridor as the first segment because it helps build momentum and allows teams in Quebec and Ontario to work together. While the segment has been announced and planning will begin, the federal government has not yet finally fully realized the funding for it. And the entire 1,000-kilometer line overseen by this Crown corporation, Alto, is expected to cost between $60 billion and $90 billion. You get a strong feeling you've heard this before. In 2002, the Jean Chrétien government announced plans to shorten the Quebec to Windsor times on rail. In 2008, 2009, Quebec and Ontario signed a deal that said they're going to study high-speed rail between Quebec City and Windsor. And in 2025, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau formally announced this project under the brand Alto. I'm Alan Carter. Ryan-Katz Rosene is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa. He's an expert in sustainable transportation and has written and commented widely on the promise of high-speed rail and why it is that Canada just cannot have nice things. Thanks for being here, Ryan. When you see these most recent promises or announcements, I guess, about high-speed rail, what do you think?
Well, I think we've been here before. One of the things I often like to recall when talking about high-speed rail is a comedy sketch by Rick Mercer, actually, where it was like a fake ad, and he's on a train, a Via train, this is a couple of years ago, and it's announcing Canada's new high-speed rail study, and the punchline being that we are experts in Canada at studying high-speed rail, but we're not very good at making those studies come to light, come to fruition, and that's often what I think about when I hear promises about high-speed rail development. So we have been here before. This time does feel a little bit different. So I am, I wouldn't be, out there saying this is not going to happen. There are kind of all the stars do seem to be aligned, but we have been here before. There was a high-speed rail project that was essentially at the same stage of development that this Alto project in the Quebec-Windsor corridor is at. And that was essentially proposed by Kathleen Wynne. It wasn't in the same corridor. It was going to go from Toronto south down towards, Windsor, London. But that project was essentially canned as soon as there was a change in government at the provincial level. So those are some of the worries that I have about, what happens in the future that we don't. What are the unknowns about the future?
I think I covered a number of those Kathleen Wynne announcements. In fact, as I studied for this, I was sort of surprised to read how many announcements about high-speed rail I have actually personally attended as a journalist.
Yeah,
there's quite a few, and as you say, still no high-speed rail. But let's talk about Alto. Let's talk about Ottawa to Montreal as the initial section. Is there a business case for high-speed rail between Ottawa and Montreal?
Well, it depends who you ask. I think there probably is. There is an effort to study this from the federal government and this agency, this Crown corporation that has been set up. to study this and examine the business case. And that's basically what they're doing right now. They're assessing the commercial feasibility. And I think they are making the calculation that there is going to be sufficient traffic if they can pull out high speed. And that this is where speed comes into the equation. For the last few years, they have not been studying high-speed rail. In fact, the government came out and said, we're not going to bother talking about high-speed rail. What we need is frequency. We need high frequency. So there was this, multi-year project, and the federal government announced we are going to be investing in high-frequency rail in that same corridor. And the idea being that it was, the passenger trains are competing with freight trains. They're having to rent track time because we don't, the passenger Via Rail doesn't own any of its own tracks.
So the segment's been announced, there's planning's going underway, but the federal government hasn't actually finalized any full funding for this. Is that a catch, do you believe? Like we talked about the change of government possibly canceling things. Is that something that could happen here, I guess?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a real possibility that this project, that if there's a change in government and a more austerity kind of focused government that is concerned about public spending comes to power, they could cancel this project. There are a wide range of assessments of how much this project is going to cost. I've seen everything from $6 billion for the high frequency rail to a comparison of $6 billion for high-frequency rail to $12 billion for high-speed rail to 10 times that. You've seen some estimates into the tens of billions of dollars. So part of the motivation is to have a partnership, a public-private partnership to bring in some capital from the private sector. And yeah, this is a huge capital expenditure from the federal government. And the idea is that, it pays off after many, many years. And, the more ridership you get, the greater revenues, the quicker that payoff comes. And so, there's a bit of a gamble here, but that's how public infrastructure is built. The federal government and the public sector has to, make a calculation on, is this going to be a project that brings about returns? Part of the argument there is that there is a growth, there's an economic growth factor that high-speed rail, increased connectivity brings to the corridor. So it's not just about, it increases all kinds of forms of economic activity. It allows people to live in nearby regions and travel to work in ways that they haven't been able to do before. It changes the housing sector. It changes the labor markets, and it increases the possibility of doing new types of things. Right? Suddenly, it becomes possible for tens of thousands of people to hold an event that maybe wouldn't have been held before. All this to say, there is the presumption that this project can provide economic benefits which help cover those costs, right?
Well, that's all very well and good, and I think this because you've written about this before. The issue is that Canada's not particularly good at actually building these kind of projects, are we?
Yeah, well, so this is the irony is that Canada was one of the first countries to have a high-speed train. We didn't have a high-speed rail service, so we had these. They were called the turbo trains. They were capable of traveling at over 200 kilometers per hour, which at the time was the benchmark speed for high-speed rail. But they never were able to travel at those speeds because they were Via Rail and never, and before that CN never had their own tracks dedicated for passenger rail. So they were running on freight tracks. And the freight trains, those tracks are classed at much slower speeds. So they were always kind of throttled in terms of how fast they could go. And ever since then, that's kind of been like this kind of parable of high-speed rail development. Passenger rail has always been played second fiddle to the freight rail system in this country. So that's one thing that this project kind of is proposing that is novel, which is having its own dedicated track infrastructure, which you need for high-speed rail. And that, if that does come about, that would, significantly improve travel times. But again, that's where the cost comes from, right? Like, it's like not just building this incredibly, this distinct, entirely new infrastructure, but, in some cases, you're going to have to go in there and expropriate properties. You're going to have to expropriate land so that you can build a relatively straight, corridor between the cities that you're building high-speed rail.
I think, what drives a lot of this, I think, for ordinary Canadians is when we travel, right? We go to Europe, maybe we go to Japan, maybe we go to the Middle East, and you see these trains and you think, why can't we have this here? Why can't we have this here? I mean, could you address that? I mean, is that crazy as Canadians to come home and go, well, why can't we have that?
Yeah, it is odd. And again, it's odd in that context of like us having, being one of the leaders in high-speed rail development without actually having high-speed trains. Again, there's a number of circumstantial factors, one of which really was this kind of like the centrality of the freight rail system. But part of it has also been a real kind of like austere perspective around public spending, which I think has played a factor. And so, you're not going to get a project like this unless the federal government is willing to spend a lot of money and upfront and not realize those gains, those returns. That's been one factor. Another factor in a Canadian context is our federalist structure, which has been a complicating factor because, this particular project is kind of seen as a project for the, the quote unquote Laurentian elites, right? It's the they're the real beneficiaries of this project because they can, get on a train and go from Toronto to Montreal and pay whatever it's going to cost, $100, $150 for a ticket to travel, to benefit from the system. And when the capital expenditures are coming from the public sector, that's essentially tax revenue, right? And so you get people out west or maybe out east saying, why are our public, tax dollars going to support this infrastructure project that is in one part of the country and not benefiting others? So that's been part of the equation. At this present moment, with all the rhetoric around, nation building and the work that this recent MOU that Mark Carney's government has signed with Alberta to develop nation building projects in other parts of the country, that seems to be an important ingredient in allowing the kind of the buy-in from the whole country for this specific corridor, because it's for this specific project, right? Because it's starting to be seen as like one of many national nation building projects that we need to embark upon in response to, U.S. tariffs and the changing economic situation. So it's really interesting to me how this specific project starts to get tied in with or interrelated with projects like an oil pipeline from Alberta to the West Coast or other infrastructure projects across the country, because it's part of the buy-in from the kind of the tax revenue mentality.
You know that Big Bargain detergent jug is 80% water, right? It doesn't clean as well.
80% water? I thought I was getting a better deal because it's so big.
If you want a better clean, Tide Pods are only 12% water. The rest is pure, concentrated cleaning ingredients.
Oh, let me make an announcement.
Attention shoppers, if you want a real deal, try Tide Pods.
Stop paying for watered-down detergents. Pay for clean. If it's gotta be clean, it's gotta be Tide Pods. Water content based on the leading bargain liquid detergent.
You mentioned the deal with Alberta. The general consensus on that was from the BC Premier is this is never going to happen. Never going to happen. You feel the same way about high-speed rail from to Toronto? Do you give that same assessment of that?
My line is essentially I'll believe it when I see it. And again, it just comes back from that long history. For 50 years, we have been studying this infrastructure, and we have made movements towards building it, and then for whatever reason, it just never gets past that next phase, that's kind of assessment feasibility stage. Maybe this time is different. But I think the window for that project overall is getting smaller, is closing. And one of the reasons is because of, changes in the transport market in the future, and we're seeing a lot of very fast changes in terms of, in particular, around vehicle automation, vehicle electrification. And I think for me, a couple of the big question marks are, how are electric vehicles, how are autonomous vehicles going to change the use case for something like, an intercity high-speed train in the Quebec-Windsor corridor?
That's fascinating, because I could, maybe science fiction-y at this moment, but I could see a point where autonomous self-driving cars could achieve, at very, very high speeds safely, if you were going from Toronto to Ottawa, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we're a little bit behind in Canada, but in California, for instance, and Texas, they are now, electric autonomous vehicles are really expanding, and they are now starting to go on highways. And so it's not, like you said, in 15 years, 20 years, it's not totally unfathomable to imagine, at the very least, that an autonomous electric vehicle, you could order it to come to your door, your front door, pick you up, take you to your exact destination in Montreal, or wherever it may be. That's door-to-door service. You don't have to drive. You can work. You can socialize with your fellow passengers, and you're in a quote-unquote private setting, right? And yeah, like you said, there's an interesting literature on, claims around the safety around autonomous electric vehicles. And the big question there becomes, like, are we then looking at a future, a nightmare situation of congestion? Because if everyone's going to be taking these EVs, maybe that will be a problem for congestion. But maybe not. Maybe as the market shifts over to autonomous vehicles, maybe we actually see a decline in vehicle ownership. Maybe we see efficiencies in the system. So it's those unknowns about the future which, again, change the use case, the proposition around the value of high-speed rail.
Is this thing a failure if it's only ever Montreal, Ottawa? Like, if they only ever complete that section of it? I mean, is that a failure if it's just that little spur?
Yeah, it would be a failure. I mean, it wouldn't be a failure from my point of view, because I, here in Ottawa, would be able to go to Montreal in an hour. But yeah, it would be a failure in the sense that, that's not what they're proposing. They are proposing a large infrastructure connecting Quebec City to Toronto. And you have to get Toronto and Montreal in that infrastructure project for it to be a real success. Those are the big cities, right? So it's an interesting gamble. It's to start with Ottawa, Montreal. In some ways, I can see that being wise. If they're successful, it does, in some ways, I could see it, other cities being like, hey, Ottawa and Montreal has this, like, why don't we get this? And it could kind of serve as a drive for expansion. On the other hand, if this project is slower than expected, if it's costlier than expected, you get a nightmare situation akin to what happened in California's high-speed rail system. So California, there's this meme in the infrastructure studies and the literature about over budget, over time, over and over again. And it's not just particular to high-speed rail, but high-speed rail infrastructure is notorious for being over budget, over time, over and over again. And one of the things that happened in California is they were aiming to build this high-speed rail between the two biggest cities in the state, but they started on the inside. They started, within that corridor, and they started building, and lo and behold, the costs started going up. Originally the projections were something like $10 billion. Then it went up a few billion, then it went up a few billion, then it went up a few billion, and now we're talking about a project that is over $100 billion US to complete this project. And so you start to see, political opposition. You start to see the opposition party saying this is a train to nowhere, this is a disaster, and then that erodes public confidence, it erodes investor confidence, and so California is really seen as this worst case scenario. And so that's one of the concerns I have about this, starting with Ottawa to Montreal. It could work out. But it is a gamble. It could be a real problem especially if those costs start to, inflate, and we end up with this situation where, we have one small corridor and that people in Ottawa and Montreal can use. And that also introduces other weird things too. Like let's say you're traveling from Ottawa or Toronto to Montreal, and for whatever reason you wanted to take a stop in Ottawa. Do you take the slow train from Toronto to Ottawa and then get on the high speed train from Ottawa to Montreal, or do you take the slower train all the way? Do you take, do you just decide then to fly? Like it starts to raise questions about the infrastructure mix in that corridor overall. So VIA really treats the Quebec City to Windsor corridor as one corridor. And so you ideally you don't want just one segment of that corridor as a high-speed train. You want the whole thing as high-speed rail.
All right, last question to you, Ryan. You've mentioned a couple times that this thing is a gamble. I don't know if you're a gambling man yourself. You want to put some odds on this? You want to put some odds on whether or not you and I can go back and forth from Montreal to Toronto in, next 15 years even?
No, I don't want. I don't want to put odds on it because
Come on, put your money on the
table. But I will say it's not. It's definitely not 100%, and that's where I think we just need to be a little bit cautious. We see a lot of media, and especially from the political rhetoric around assuming this project is going to happen. And that's what I would caution against. Like, this is not 100% proposition. This is not a done deal. We are talking about years before final decisions are made. So this has to be a project that is going to withstand potentially a changing government, and changing market forces, changing global, geopolitical dynamics. The current political situation nationally and in Ontario and Quebec, that situation at this present moment, it really does seem conducive to building this project, but there are no guarantees that that's going to be the case in 4 or 5 years. So I would kind of put it at a 50-50, unfortunately, because
welcome to Canada.
Yeah,
flip a coin. Ryan, great to talk to you. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks so much for your interest in this project, Alan, and happy to chat with you as well.
That was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Reach us on Instagram @frequencypods or on Blue Sky @thebigstory. If you know somebody who might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Alan Carter. Thanks for listening.